For the last 4 years, Democrats have controlled both chambers of Congress, but in that time, not one single piece of serious legislation was ever introduced which would have lowered the cost of energy. So what has been done to help ease energy costs? What solutions do my friends across the aisle have?
What does this bill do instead? It's almost as if you gave a pen to an oil lobbyist and wrote down everything that they'd want. Much of that was in this bill. We are looking at reducing big oil's royalty rates to the public, slashing interest fees. In this bill, Republicans are squarely on the side of fossil fuel companies. It makes it harder for communities to fight big oil when they don't want them drilling in their own backyards. It also threatens our public lands and allows anyone to stake a mining claim on our public lands for less than $10 an acre, even if they haven't discovered any minerals.
Let's be clear. Oil companies brought in $200 billion in profit last year, while high energy prices meant that many families struggled to keep food on the table. Companies are profiting off of a volatile global market by pushing domestic prices higher, while communities here at home continue to suffer from the impacts of oil and gas development. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call an oil cartel.
Now, I want to echo a little bit of one of my earlier colleagues' comments in that we are very grateful for many of the decisions and policies coming out of the department, but we are also very concerned about some of this business as usual, to use his words, around oil and gas development. As was stated several times during this hearing, oil production is at an all-time high under the Biden administration, higher than even under the Trump administration. Part of that, within the context of that, is the department's decision around the Willow Project.
A new oil drilling project in Alaska has the green light from the Biden administration. Climate activists fought hard to stop this initiative called the Willow Master Development Plan.
Environmentalists are outraged by this, saying that this is a reversal by President Biden in terms of his commitments to addressing climate change.
And science tells us that how we act or fail to act in the next 12 years will determine the very livability of our planet. By 2050, the United States will be 100% clean energy economy with net zero emissions.
There has been overwhelming opposition around the department's decision to approve the Willow Project, which was picked up after the Trump administration's decision was turned over in an attempt to do the same. This project was first approved under the Trump administration in 2020 and tossed out in court as unlawful. It instructed the BLM to reassess the project's full climate impact and consider alternatives. When the Biden administration then picked up Trump's failed project for a second approval attempt, it seems to have still failed to meet the court's assessment requirements. In fact, we have heard from the New Exit community leaders that have maintained that the BLM has, quote unquote, completely failed to acknowledge their attempts at consultation. And I would like to submit that letter from them to the record. Additionally, the Alaska Wilderness League has confirmed that they were not consulted at all before the department released the environmental impact statement. But I would actually like to direct my question to Mr. Boudreau as the Deputy Secretary of the Department. I am interested in the decision-making process and the contours of the decision-making process around Willow. Who within the department were some of the key stakeholders? Who are the leaders involved in making this decision?
So the decision is on Bureau, well, the Willow Project was an application before the Bureau of Land Management. And so BLM Alaska staff conducted the analysis, the supplemental EIS analysis, as directed by the court. Also involved, of course, through the chain of command was, BLM director and the principal deputy assistant secretary for land and minerals. At the end, ultimately, I signed the record of decision, and so it's my signature on that document.
So you signed the record of decision around the Willow Project?
Yes.
Did the White House at any point weigh in on this, on a preference on this decision with you?
As with all of the matters in front of the department, we of course coordinate with the White House. At the end of the day, though, permitting decision like Willow is one that rests with the Secretary and her authorities. And as Deputy Secretary, I was the one who signed the record of decision.
And did BLM or anyone in the department provide rationale for not consulting some of the major stakeholders or failing to consult properly or account properly, such as the consultation from the New Exit community or the Alaska Wilderness League?
So again, you know, both Rosemary, the mayor, and New Exit, and folks at Alaska Wilderness League are people that we know well in the department, and I know well personally. And so, you know, I don't mean to contradict, but there has been throughout this process very close communication with New Exit as well as with all interested stakeholders.
Thank you. And one last question. Given the precarious nature of the project's approval in the courts, and given your role in the decision, will the department consider holding off on approving permits to drill for Willow until the litigation is settled?
The posture of the department right now is that the record of decision has been issued. There has been litigation filed. Absent an injunction from the court, the project has the approvals to conduct the activities reflected in the record of decision.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank the ranking member, and you know, there was some discussion made earlier, an allegation that Democrats have yet to introduce any policy to reduce our energy costs, as if we have completely forgotten about the sweeping multi-billion-dollar investments in the Inflation Reduction Act to reduce people's costs across the board. But I'm rising today to stand in opposition to H.R. 1. You know, while Republicans try to claim that this is a bill to lower people's energy costs, we really see when you start digging into it that what this bill actually shows us by the Republican authors is that they actually have no plan to reduce our utility bills or even prevent climate disaster in the United States. The central argument and logic of this bill is that if you give big oil everything they want, then perhaps they will lower our gas prices. It's a form of trickle-down fantasy that just will not make life easier for everyday Americans. What H.R. 1 will do is give big oil more leases of public lands. And this idea that an increased supply of fossil fuels will drive down prices is also mistaken. Let's look at what happened last year. We saw how big oil more than doubled its profits to $219 billion, all while price gouging customers at the pump, not because of supply issues, but because they can. Republicans opposed solutions that we even put forward, like a windfall tax on price gouging on big oil in order to prevent these kinds of behaviors. But fossil fuel companies, moreover, already have thousands of unused permits on public lands, and yet they want even more. This is not a problem of supply, it is a problem of greed and abuse of market power. For people following at home, if you are a member of the American public, if you are a tax-paying citizen, you are part of the ownership of our public lands. And when an oil company decides to lease that land, they are supposed to pay a royalty to the public. What does H.R. 1 do? Slashes that royalty rate so that there is very little payback or investment into the American people and many of our programs. And despite the fact that more than 40% of Americans live in counties hit by climate disasters, this bill prohibits agencies from even considering climate change when deciding whether or not to issue a permit to a drilling company. None of these things are going to lower our costs at the pump. None of these things are going to actually reduce our utility bills. And in fact, in talking about this allegation of a lack of democratic proposals, Democrats introduced 95 amendments, proposed 95 amendments to this bill, and the Republican majority rejected all but 7. I myself personally sponsored an amendment in the spirit of this bill, allegedly, to try to reduce prices. And my amendment would have made sure that the subsidies that the federal government provides to oil and gas companies actually make their way to the American people instead of lining the pockets of billionaire CEOs, but actually having the intended effect. But Republicans rejected that amendment too. They've made clear where they stand. And I could not emphasize enough how detrimental and damaging this bill would be, not only to the climate crisis, not only to the purpose of even trying to reduce our utility costs, but moreover, from the ability for the American people to actually receive an investment on the public lands that they lease out. And with that, I yield back to the ranking member.
Ms. Ashland, in Mr. Atencio's written testimony, he mentions that your company, Enduring Resources, spilled over 40,000 gallons of toxic fracking slurry mixed with crude oil onto his family's allotment near Chaco Canyon. Do you dispute this fact?
Enduring Resources has informed me that the spill did not occur on Mr. Atencio's allotment. It did occur. There was a spill in 2019. It was about 300 barrels of oil and about 1,000 barrels of water. It was cleaned up immediately, and it was...
So the spill did occur of 40,000?
The spill occurred. It was in the middle of February, and it was resulted from a frozen pipe.
But you dispute that it touched Mr. Atencio's allotment?
I've been told that it did not.
Mr. Atencio, was this spill on your allotment?
Yes, my father's allotment.
Okay. Ms. Ashland, did Enduring Resources pay any fines for impacts to land or water from that spill? Just simple yes or no?
No.
No. So the company did not pay any fines for the impact of that spill. Mr. Atencio, did your family or your chapter ever hear at all from Enduring Resources about this spill?
Ranking member, no, we have yet to receive any formal response from Enduring Resources.
And I think this is something that speaks to a pattern that we have seen in front of this committee. To be clear, the kinds of pollution from that spill and a spill of that magnitude is profound, with highly noxious, hazardous air pollutants and methane that either leak inadvertently or are vented or flared by operators. I have seen it in person. I have seen families burn when they breathe in some of this air. And in fact, so much methane spills out of industrial vents in the region that the methane cloud over New Mexico is now visible from space. We see this, and it happens not just in this instance, but in many others, where I have brought this point in front of this committee that people deserve to know if they are being poisoned, whether it's by accident or whether it's by any other process. And they are not being informed. They are not being told. The CDC also tells us that exposure to these pollutants can cause significant long-term health damage. Mr. Atencio, since the 2019 spill, have Enduring Resources or other oil and gas companies taken any steps to notify nearby communities of methane leaks, oil spills, or other incidents?
No.
And as Enduring Resources started building the infrastructure necessary to produce fossil fuels in the community, were you ever informed of the risk associated with these plants?
No.
Now, one thing I do want to speak to is the very real economic harm and injustice associated with this issue. Because Native people and Indigenous communities have been abused and have not been respected. And in stripping everything away, we now are in an economic hostage situation where people feel like the only opportunity and that the only source is to acquiesce to oil and gas. And the answer to that is not to revert back, in my view, not to revert back to that, but to invest and reinvest in these communities, particularly where there is harm being done, particularly where there is disinvestment being done. And if families are being impacted in these allotments, they deserve economic restitution.
Today's hearing is an opportunity to examine the federal offshore oil and gas program. The urgency to address federal fossil fuel development is undeniable as we endure the 6th straight week of record-breaking heat waves from Arizona to New York City. As it stands, the United States is the world's #1 producer of oil and gas and the 2nd highest emitter of greenhouse gas pollution. Our public lands and waters contribute nearly a quarter to those emissions. As the federal government, we have an obligation to make our public lands part of the solution to the climate crisis rather than the problem. The Outer Continental Shelf Act, which allows the federal government to lease lands in our federal waters, was passed to secure national energy security. With the support of federal agencies like the Department of Interior and the Department of Energy, our nation has pioneered offshore technologies that set the global standard. But the current arguments characterizing energy independence lose credibility when you discover that the United States is currently exporting 50% more oil and gas than we did in 2019, all while prices we see at the pump here at home and on our utility bills remain high. These companies operate with light oversight and almost total disregard for the substantial pollution they cause, their climate impacts, and the neighboring communities that have become sacrifice zones. So whose security is really at stake here? Let's get into what it could look like to protect our workers. To date, offshore drilling companies have amassed thousands of leases covering more than 11 million acres of federal waters. A staggering 74% of these leases have never produced oil or gas. 9 million acres remain leased but inactive. Despite these massive holdings, these companies continue to seek more. Companies will claim they are creating new jobs, but these claims fall flat as we witness the oil and gas industry systematically automate, shedding its workforce, leaving fuel workers with declining wages and uncertain futures as CEOs take in million-dollar bonuses. Between 2008 and 2019, offshore oil production in the federal waters off Louisiana increased by 44%, while direct employment in the industry crashed by 62%. A 2020 survey of offshore workers in the Gulf revealed that nearly 50% had been laid off at least once, and 15% reported being laid off more than once. We are producing more oil and gas than ever with fewer and fewer people. For generations, workers in the Gulf of Mexico have risked life and limb to sustain our way of life. But now it's time to build upon that legacy and look towards the future. We owe American workers energy stability and protection, not hollow promises. So I ask again, as our communities lose jobs to volatile oil companies, whose security is really at stake when we talk about energy security and independence? And let's get into what it would look like to protect frontline communities. Gulf Coast communities bear the brunt of these impacts, economic and environmental. These communities experience the booms and busts of a volatile industry. Oil spills degrade fishing grounds and threaten coastal livelihoods. Pipeline canals and petroleum withdrawal have decimated the iconic boot of southern Louisiana. The release of toxic pollutants from industry leads to respiratory illnesses, disease, and higher rates of cancer. A 2001 study discovered that more than 80% of residents of Port Arthur, Texas, the predominantly Black West Side, suffered heart and lung ailments. Oil and gas infrastructure also destroys habitat and disrupts migratory patterns, endangering local biodiversity. Indigenous communities and low-income neighborhoods, which are more often closer to this infrastructure, suffer significant losses in cultural heritage and subsistence resources. Rather than maintaining the status quo and propping up the fossil fuel industry, let's invest in the cleanup of the thousands of miles of abandoned pipelines and countless abandoned wells and rigs to create jobs and protect the environment. The Interior Department's recently proposed regulations to hold companies better accountable with stronger financial assurances for cleanup of used wells is a step in the right direction. Last Congress, we signed into law historic investments in climate and clean energy, including long overdue reforms to offshore oil and gas programs and essential investments in renewable energy to further the transition through the Inflation Reduction Act. But that legislation also included a deal to tie future renewable energy to leasing to oil and gas leasing for the next 10 years. This provision forces us to choose continued burdens for environmental justice communities or renewable energy development to fight the climate crisis, a choice that we should not be forced to make. It's time we right that wrong and advance renewable energy without forced ties to fossil fuels. Yesterday, I introduced the Non-Restrictive Offshore Wind Act, or the NOW Act, to repeal that tie and pave the way for clean, union-led offshore wind industry. The stakes are high, the health of the planet and the well-being of the workforce and future generations hang in the balance. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back to the chair.